Emily Johnson pushed open the service door of the Grand Regency Hotel in San Francisco, her sneakers squeaking on the slick concrete. The air inside held a hint of lemon polish, a stark contrast to the musty, cigarette-tinged smell of her Mission District apartment, one of the city's grittiest corners. She adjusted her name tag, Housekeeping, Emily, and fell into the rhythm of another exhausting shift. At 27, Emily was accustomed to being invisible. Guests in tailored suits glided past her in the marble halls, their gazes skimming over her as if she were part of the furnishings. Even her co-workers, many from wealthier neighborhoods, kept their distance, their conversations brief and guarded. Emily didn't mind. She'd learned early that silence was safer than trying to belong. But Emily was more than her worn uniform and cleaning cart. She held a degree in foreign languages from San Francisco City College, earned with distinction despite juggling 2 jobs to cover tuition. Fluent in English, French, Spanish, and recently German, a language she adored after a visiting professor from Munich recognized her talent and guided her. She was a scholar at heart. He'd sent her textbooks, emailed grammar exercises, and called her his undiscovered star. Yet, her skills couldn't break her free. Job applications for translation or office roles returned with polite rejections or silence. She once overheard a recruiter murmur, "She's from the Mission, probably flaky." Her address, her thrift store clothes, the weariness of years spent scraping by, it all seemed to shout unworthy before she could speak. The injustice stung, but Emily buried it. She had no choice. After her mother's death from a prolonged illness, medical bills had consumed their savings, leaving Emily with crushing debt and a studio apartment where the heat flickered. She'd taken the housekeeping job at the Grand Regency for its reliability, even if it meant scrubbing toilets instead of using her degree. Still, she clung to her dream. Each night, after her shift, she rode the bus to the San Francisco Public Library, using free computers to practice German vocabulary and listen to language podcasts. It was her anchor, proof she was more than her circumstances. Every morning, before heading to work, Emily unfolded a worn letter from her mother, written in faint, unsteady script during her final days. "You're destined for greatness, Emily," it read. "Learn, rise, and break free from the shadows. I believe in you." Emily traced the words, her throat tightening. Her mother had been a laundress, working grueling hours to keep Emily in school, sacrificing her health for her daughter's future. Reading the letter was Emily's ritual, a vow to persevere, no matter how heavy her life felt. She tucked it away, grabbed her bag, and stepped out, the words lingering in her mind. At the Grand Regency, Emily's day began as always, clocking in, gathering supplies, and heading to the 7th floor. She moved swiftly, polishing mirrors, vacuuming carpets, and restocking towels in suites that cost more per night than her rent. The work was draining, but she took pride in it, even if no one noticed. Her supervisor, a sharp-tongued woman named Karen, rarely spoke unless to critique a smudge. Other housekeepers, mostly older women from similar backgrounds, offered fleeting smiles but kept to themselves. Emily understood. In a place like the Grand Regency, survival meant staying unnoticed. Yet the unfairness of her situation ate at her. She'd seen interns, fresh from college with half her skills, secure corporate jobs because their parents had connections or they fit the image. Emily, with her calloused hands and secondhand clothes, was never considered. Once she overheard a guest complain about people like her working in a luxury hotel as if her presence tarnished the elegance. The words cut deep, but Emily swallowed the pain. Pausing to feel it would mean unraveling, and she couldn't afford that. As she pushed her cart down the corridor, Emily whispered her mother's words, "Break free from the shadows." She didn't know how, but she believed one day, somehow, she'd find a way. For now, she was just a housekeeper, invisible to the world. But deep within, a spark of hope glowed, fueled by the letter in her pocket and the dream she refused to release. Little did she know, that spark was about to ignite. Emily sat alone in the staff break room, a cramped, windowless space behind the Grand Regency's kitchen. The vending machine's hum was her only companion as she opened her container of leftover rice and beans. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen, her heart racing. A message from Dr. Franz Moeller, her German professor and mentor. "Call me when you're free. Great news." Her fingers shook as she dialed, the weight of countless library nights pressing against her chest. When Franz answered, his warm voice filled her ear. "Emily, you did it. You passed the professional German fluency certification. With honors." A shaky laugh escaped her. "Really?" she asked in German, her words fluid and natural. Franz chuckled, praising her commitment. Nights spent mastering verbs, mornings practicing pronunciation before shifts. "You're not just fluent," he said. "You're extraordinary." Tears stung Emily's eyes as she leaned back, clutching the phone. The break room vanished, and for a moment, she was a girl again, sitting with her mother, vowing to make her proud. The certification wasn't just a credential. It was proof she hadn't let the shadows win. She was still speaking German, thanking Franz. When the door creaked open, Emily froze, her heart lurching as Michael Bennett stepped inside. The billionaire owner of the Grand Regency was unmistakable. Tall, with angular features and silver-streaked hair, his presence commanding even in a simple gray suit. Staff gossiped about him, a self-made man who rarely spoke to anyone below management. Emily scrambled to her feet, ending the call abruptly. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her face flushing. "I was on break." Michael raised a hand, his expression calm but intrigued. "No need to apologize. Was that German?" Emily nodded, avoiding his gaze, expecting a reprimand. "Where did you learn it?" he asked, his tone gentler than she anticipated. "College, sir," she said softly. "I studied languages. German's my passion." She braced for dismissal, but Michael tilted his head, studying her. "What's your name?" "Emily Johnson," she replied, her hands clenching. He nodded, as if committing it to memory. "Thank you, Emily. Enjoy your break." Then he was gone, leaving her stunned. Emily sank back into her chair, her pulse racing. It was nothing, she told herself, just a passing moment. But the way he'd said her name lingered, as if he'd truly seen her for the first time. She pushed the thought aside, finishing her lunch in silence, the joy of her certification now mixed with unease. The rest of her shift blurred by, her mind replaying the encounter, searching for meaning where there likely was none. The next morning, as Emily clocked in, her supervisor Karen pulled her aside. "HR wants you, immediately." Emily's stomach sank. Had she violated a rule? Was it the phone call? She walked to the HR office, her sneakers silent on the marble floor, her mother's letter a steady weight in her pocket. Inside, Ms. Susan Davis, the HR director, gestured for her to sit. "This is unusual," Susan began, her tone neutral. "Mr. Bennett has requested your reassignment. Effective immediately, you're the new specialist in international guest relations." Emily blinked, the words not sinking in. "I'm sorry, what?" Susan slid a contract across the desk. "You'll assist high-profile guests, handle translations, manage cultural details. The salary is triple your current pay." Emily's breath caught. Triple. She stared at the contract, her hands trembling. "Is this real?" she whispered. Susan's lips twitched slightly. "Very real. Mr. Bennett said your talents are wasted cleaning rooms." Emily pressed her fingers to her pocket, feeling her mother's letter. For the first time in years, she felt visible, not as a housekeeper, but as Emily Johnson, the woman who'd never stopped fighting. But why her? And what did Michael Bennett really want? Emily stood in the Grand Regency's staff dressing room, staring at her reflection. Gone was the shapeless housekeeping uniform, replaced by a tailored gray blazer and white blouse, her new name tag reading, "International Guest Relations, Emily Johnson." The clothes fit perfectly, but she felt like a fraud, as if she'd borrowed someone else's life. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her collar, her mother's letter in her pocket grounding her. She whispered its words. Break free from the shadow's polished corridors, no longer pushing a cleaning cart, but carrying a tablet with guest profiles. Her new role, was a universe away from scrubbing floors. Emily now assisted international VIPs translating conversations and navigating cultural nuances. She was thrust into meetings with executives and diplomats, expected to speak fluently and act refined, but the transition was rocky. Her colleagues in guest relations, mostly from privileged backgrounds with elite degrees and polished manners, treated her with veiled contempt. At her first team meeting, a coworker named Lauren, with a cutting smile, asked loudly, "So, Emily, how do you go from mopping floors to this? Quite the jump." The room grew quiet, and Emily's face burned. She muttered something about hard work, but the laughter that followed felt like a slap. The unfairness didn't end there. Lauren and others excluded Emily from informal strategy sessions, leaving her to navigate protocols alone. Once, Lauren handed her a pile of German documents with no guidance, smirking as she walked away. "You're the language expert, right? Figure it out." Emily stayed late, deciphering the files, her eyes burning from fatigue. She couldn't fail. Not when this was her only shot, but the pressure was crushing, and the whispers followed her. "Bennett's favorite," they called her behind her back, suggesting her promotion was a favor, not earned. The label stung, especially because Emily herself questioned why Michael had chosen her. Guests weren't much kinder. During her first week, a wealthy German executive questioned her qualifications mid-conversation, his tone laced with doubt. "You speak German well for someone like you," he said, glancing at her name tag. Emily forced a smile, translating his requests perfectly, but the words echoed the rejections she'd faced for years. She was still the girl from the Mission District, no matter how well she spoke or dressed. Each slight, each doubt, eroded her confidence, making her wonder if she belonged in this world of crystal chandeliers and power. Her first major challenge came with a meeting involving German investors exploring a partnership for the Grand Regency's European expansion. Michael had personally asked Emily to assist, trusting her to bridge linguistic and cultural gaps. In the glass-walled conference room, she stood beside him, her heart pounding, as the investors, stern men in sharp suits, entered. Emily introduced herself in flawless German, her voice steady despite her nerves. The room warmed, their postures easing as she translated Michael's pitch with precision, weaving in cultural context to smooth tensions. When an investor asked a sharp question about profit margins, Emily caught a cultural nuance in his tone, a test of trust, not numbers. She whispered the insight to Michael, who adjusted his response. The investor nodded, impressed, and the meeting ended with handshakes and tentative agreements. Michael pulled her aside afterward, his eyes bright. "You were incredible, Emily. You didn't just translate. You made them feel heard." His praise warmed her, but it couldn't erase the day's weight. She smiled, thanking him, but inside she felt like she was on borrowed time. What if she slipped? What if they saw through her polished facade to the terrified woman beneath? That night, Emily returned to her Mission District apartment, the air thick with the smell of mildew. She sank onto her tattered couch, pulling her mother's letter from her pocket. Her fingers traced the familiar words, but tears blurred her vision. The certification, the promotion, the praise. It was everything she'd dreamed of, yet it felt like a fragile dream. The world she'd entered didn't want her, not truly. They saw her as an outsider, a charity case, not a peer. She thought of her mother, who'd worked herself to exhaustion for Emily's future, and guilt hit hard. Was she betraying that sacrifice by doubting herself? Or was she betraying herself by pretending she could belong? Emily pressed the letter to her chest, her sobs quiet in the dark. She wanted to believe she could do this, that she could break free from the shadows as her mother had urged. But the voices of Lauren, of the executive, of her own fears, whispered she'd never be enough. Still, she clung to the letter, to its spark of hope. She didn't know how, but she'd keep fighting. For her mother, for herself. Emily moved through the Grand Regency's bustling lobby, her tablet gripped tightly, her new role now a familiar burden. The German investors had signed a preliminary deal, thanks largely to her translations, and Michael had praised her publicly in a staff meeting. Yet the victory felt empty. Lauren and her circle still whispered behind her back, their words sharp. She's just lucky Bennett took a liking to her. The unfairness of their judgment gnawed at Emily, echoing every rejection she'd faced for being from the Mission District. But she pressed on, determined to prove them wrong. Not for their approval, but for the promise she'd made to her mother. One afternoon, Michael found her in the staff lounge, reviewing guest profiles. "Emily, can I borrow you for an hour?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. She hesitated, unsure if it was a work request or something more, but nodded. They ended up at a cozy cafe in the Marina District, its wooden tables scuffed and warm, far from the Grand Regency's sheen. Over coffee, Michael thanked her for her work with the investors. "You didn't just save the deal," he said, his eyes steady. "You made it personal." Emily blushed, unused to such direct praise. For the first time, she saw him not as a distant billionaire, but as a man with his own quiet struggles. The conversation deepened. Michael shared that he'd grown up in a struggling neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked as a janitor. "She kept me grounded," he said, his voice soft. "Even when I built hotels, she'd remind me who I was." Emily felt a pang of connection. She opened up about her own mother, about nights spent dreaming over library books. Her mother's hands rough from washing clothes, but gentle when tucking her in. "She got sick and I couldn't save her," Emily admitted, her voice breaking. "But she left me this letter. It's what keeps me going." Michael listened, his silence full of empathy, and for a moment, Emily felt a bond beyond words. Back at the Grand Regency, Michael gave Emily more responsibility. He asked her to lead a small team handling international guests, a role requiring coordination with staff who barely acknowledged her. Lauren, now openly hostile, excluded Emily from team dinners, claiming they were just for the inner circle. Other colleagues followed suit, leaving Emily to eat alone in the break room, her rice and beans tasting of isolation. The loneliness stung, echoing the years she'd been dismissed for her background. Yet each slight fueled her resolve. She stayed late, refining schedules and studying cultural etiquette, determined to be undeniable. One evening, after a grueling day, Michael stopped by her desk. He held a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed. "This was my mother's," he said, handing it to her. "German poetry. She loved it, but never had time to read it. I thought you might." Emily's breath caught as she opened it, seeing handwritten notes in the margins, traces of a woman who'd dreamed beyond her circumstances. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Michael smiled faintly. "Because you see the world like she did, with heart." The gesture pierced her, and tears welled as she clutched the book, feeling her mother's letter in her pocket, a silent bridge between two women who'd fought for their children. Emily began to carry herself with new confidence. Leading her team, she spoke with quiet authority, earning reluctant respect from some colleagues. Guests requested her by name, praising her warmth and precision. Yet the whispers persisted, rumors that her success was tied to Michael's favor, not her skill. At a company event, Lauren cornered her, her voice venomous. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Emily. People like you don't belong in rooms like this." The words cut deep, rekindling Emily's fear that she was an imposter, destined to fail. That night, in her Mission District apartment, Emily held her mother's letter and the poetry book side by side. She read a line from the book, "In darkness, we find our own light," and felt her mother's words echo in her heart. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for everyone told they didn't belong. The connection with Michael, fragile and unspoken, gave her strength, but it also scared her. What did it mean to be seen by someone like him, and could she trust it when the world still saw her as less? Emily closed her eyes, the weight of her journey heavy but not crushing. She was finding her place, one step at a time. Emily's newfound confidence carried her through weeks of demanding work, but it was a fragile shield against the whispers. She led her team with quiet authority, earning praise from guests and nods from colleagues. Yet the rumors persisted. Her success was a fluke, a gift from Michael Bennett, not her own. The sting of being called Bennett's favorite grew sharper. a reminder of the world's refusal to see her as more than a housekeeper from the Mission District. Each day, Emily clutched her mother's letter and the poetry book, their words anchoring her against doubt. One evening, Michael approached her as she finalized a guest itinerary. "Emily, I'd like you to join me for dinner," he said, his voice soft but intentional. "Not here, at my home." Her heart raced, torn between curiosity and caution. She'd never been invited into such a personal space, but the warmth in his eyes, the same warmth from the cafe, made her agree. The drive to his home in Nob Hill was quiet. Emily's thoughts a tangle of hope and fear. What did he want? And could she trust it? Michael's home was warm, not a sterile mansion, filled with books and old photos. He cooked dinner himself, a simple pasta dish. His sleeves rolled up as he stirred sauce. Over candlelight, the distance between them faded. Michael spoke of his mother, her dream of running a small bed and breakfast, dreams he'd turned into an empire at the cost of personal connections. "I've built so much," he said, his voice heavy, "but I've lost more." Emily shared her own losses, her mother's illness, the guilt of surviving when she hadn't. "Every step I take," she whispered, "feels like I'm carrying her with me." As they cleared the dishes, Michael paused, his gaze steady. "Emily, I need to be honest," he said. "You're not just an employee to me. You're someone I admire, someone I care about, deeply." The words hung between them, tender and terrifying. Emily's breath caught, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. But fear surged too. If she let this happen, would the world reduce her to a stereotype? A woman who'd risen through a man's affection? She thought of Lauren's venom, the colleagues who'd never respect her, the executive who doubted her for being someone like you. The unfairness crashed over her. She'd fought to be seen for her mind, her work, her resilience, but the rumors were relentless. Just days earlier, an anonymous post on a hotel gossip forum had called her the housekeeper who charmed the boss, with mocking emojis. Colleagues whispered in the break room, their eyes cutting to her. Even a junior staffer had asked, half joking, if she'd learned German to impress Bennett. Each word was a blade carving away her pride. To love Michael, to even consider it, risked everything she'd earned. Emily stepped back, her hands trembling. "Michael, I can't," she said, her voice breaking. "You've given me so much, but if we do this, they'll say I'm only here because of you. They'll erase everything I've done." Michael's face softened, but pain flickered in his eyes. "I'd never let that happen," he said. "But I understand. Your worth isn't tied to me, Emily. It never was." His respect, his willingness to let her choose, only made her heart ache more. That night, in her Mission District apartment, Emily sat on her couch, the poetry book open to the line Michael's mother had loved. "In darkness, we find our own light." Beside it lay her mother's letter, its words a lifeline. "You're destined for greatness." Tears streamed down her face as she wrestled with her choice. She wanted Michael, not just his kindness, but the man who saw her soul. Yet, she wanted her dignity more. The right to stand as Emily Johnson, not a shadow of someone else's story. The world had tried to break her with its judgments, but she wouldn't let it. She closed the book, her resolve hardening. Whatever came next, she'd face it on her terms, carrying her mother's dream and her own light. Emily sat across from Michael in his office, the San Francisco skyline visible through the window. Her decision to step away from his feelings weighed heavily, but she held her ground. "I need to be seen for who I am, Michael," she said, her voice steady, despite the ache in her chest. "Not as your partner, not as a story people twist, just me." Michael's eyes held a flicker of pain, but he nodded, his respect unwavering. "You've always been more than enough," he said. Then, with quiet resolve, he offered her a new role, leading the international strategy for the hotel's Munich expansion. "This isn't charity," he added. "It's because you're the best for it." Emily accepted, throwing herself into the project. She flew to Munich, coordinating with investors, translating complex negotiations, and mentoring a small team. Her fluency and empathy shone, earning respect from colleagues who once doubted her. The deal closed successfully, a triumph that echoed her mother's words, "You're destined for greatness." But as Emily stood in the sleek Munich office, she felt a pull towards something deeper. The whispers of Bennett's favorite had faded, but the unfairness she'd faced lingered. "You're destined for greatness," she thought, her fingers tracing her mother's letter. She had broken free from her own shadows, but what about others still trapped? Back in San Francisco, Emily made a bold choice. She approached Michael with a proposal, not for herself, but for the Mission District. "I want to open a community center," she told him, her voice firm. "A place for people like me, workers, immigrants, anyone the world ignores, to learn languages, skills, anything to give them a chance." Michael listened, his eyes bright with pride. He offered a grant, not as a gift, but as an investment in her vision. Emily accepted, determined to build it on her terms. The center took shape in a modest Mission District storefront, its walls adorned with murals by local artists. Emily named it Hope's Haven, inspired by the poetry line her mother's book held dear, "In darkness, we find our own light." She taught German classes herself, alongside volunteers offering coding, resume writing, and English lessons. The first students, single parents, busboys, teens from broken homes, reminded her of the girl she'd been, clutching dreams against a world that didn't care. At the opening ceremony, Emily stood before a small crowd, her mother's letter in one hand, the poetry book in the other. She read aloud from the letter, her voice trembling, "Learn, rise, and break free from the shadows. I believe in you." Tears streaked her face as she looked at faces like her own, worn but hopeful. "This place is for us," she said, "for everyone told they're not enough. You are, and we'll prove it together." The room erupted in applause, and Emily's heart swelled. She'd kept her promise to her mother, not just for herself, but for those who needed it most. Michael attended, standing quietly at the back. Their eyes met, and Emily saw pride, not pity, in his gaze. They hadn't spoken of their feelings since that night, but the space between them held a silent understanding. He'd given her a chance, but she'd built this herself. As the crowd dispersed, Emily hung a framed photo of her mother on the center's wall, her smile radiant despite her pain. "We did it, Mom," Emily whispered, her fingers brushing the glass. Months later, Emily stood in Hope's Haven, watching her students grow, some landing better jobs, others enrolling in college. The center had become a beacon in the Mission District, a place where dreams took root. But Emily felt a quiet restlessness. She'd built something extraordinary, yet her heart tugged toward Michael, the man who'd seen her when no one else had. The fear of gossip had once held her back, but now, standing in the light of her own strength, she wondered if she'd been too cautious. One evening, Emily invited Michael to the center, not as a donor, but as a friend. They sat in the quiet classroom, surrounded by books and student artwork. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice soft. "Scared that loving you would make the world see me as less. But I'm not that girl anymore. I know who I am." Michael's eyes softened, a smile breaking through. "You've always been enough, Emily. I just wanted to be part of your light." She reached for his hand, her mother's letter in her pocket, its words now a celebration, not a shield. "Let's try," she said, her voice steady, not as a boss and employee, but as two people who see each other. Michael squeezed her hand, and in that moment, the whispers of the world faded. Emily had built Hope's Haven, honored her mother, and claimed her place. Now she chose love, not as a sacrifice, but as a partner in her journey. As they stepped outside, the Mission District's noise, sirens, laughter blended with the warmth of their shared silence. Emily smiled, the poetry book's words echoing, "In darkness, we find our own light." She'd found hers, not just in the center, but in the courage to embrace all parts of herself, her dreams, her past, and the man beside her. The world would always have its judgments, but Emily Johnson was unstoppable. A woman who'd turned shadows into hope, for herself and for those she loved.